As you notice, we start a bit late, but we have been promised that we were nevertheless given 1.5 hours. So we will keep the time for the session, even though we are constantly running a bit late here, maybe. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks 2013 report is developed from an annual survey of over 1,000 experts from industry, government, academia, and civil society who were asked to review a landscape of 50 different global risks of all aspects. So water came fourth place when it comes to the likelihood, likelihood to appear as a risk within a short time frame. Immediately after other risks such as income disparity, fiscal imbalances, and increased greenhouse gas emissions. And on second place when it comes to the impact after major systematic financial failure, but before other risks such as chronic fiscal imbalances, food shortage crisis, and diffusion of weapons of mass destruction. So as you hear, there are very different sort of risks, and water was indeed very highly ranked there, and it's the second year in a row that this has happened. In another survey focusing on the private sector, CEOs of many companies really start to realize that water underpins all economic activities, including their own. So in the 2012 CDP Carbon Disclosure Project Water Disclosure Questionnaire sent out to 500 of the world's largest companies, 58% stated that they are currently experiencing disruptions in their operation due to water shortages or quality concern. And half responded that they will face risk of disruption within the next couple of years. And that is also an increase compared to the last survey that was done a couple of years ago, when there was only 38% who stated that they were facing these kind of disruptions. And what affects the economy of a company eventually will affect also the economy of the country where they are operating. One of the differences, I think, between a company and a country is that the time frame between when a resource constraints appear and when it hits the bottom line of the economy is much shorter, of course, in a company than in a country. But the basic and fundamental mechanisms are the same. We also know that over 1.7 billion people currently live in river basins where water use exceeds recharge, leading to the desiccation of rivers and depletion of groundwater. For these river basins, agreeing on how to reduce demand and agree on allocation between different users will be a very politically sensitive process where trade-offs between various uses have to be discussed. The pressure on and pollution of water resources that more and more countries are experiencing will undoubtedly increase in the future. So the challenges are already here today. They are very serious, and unfortunately, they will increase also in the future. My name is Anders Berntell. I'm the head of the so-called 2030 Water Resources Group, a public-private partnership that works to address water scarcity, water challenges in certain countries around the world. Some of you might have received a short brochure that describes some of the work that we do. I have the privilege of being the moderator of this session. I know that we will have a very interesting session. I've had the privilege of having a look at the presentations already beforehand, so I can say that we do have a very good session here. We also have a very distinguished and qualified panel that you see here with a lot of experiences from many years of work within the water sector and related areas. We will have a session here that seeks to identify and discuss the way forward towards establishing effective global policies on water in very diverse settings and how such policies can be translated into practical action on the ground through cutting-edge innovative technologies and properly allocated funds. As you have seen, we have a very wide variety of topics in the session: water and disasters, water and green growth, the need for Sustainable Development Goals on water, Transboundary water, and water, food, energy, climate nexus, and the green economy and the links there. So indeed, a very interesting session. I will start this without any further introductions. We will start with the first speaker, with the first presenter, and I will not read the full CV. You have it already in your program. But Dr. Hyesop Wu, who is the president of the Korea Institute of Construction Technology, which is a public research institute dedicated to the development of construction technology and policy making of national land and management in Korea. Also an outstanding professional career as a researcher. He will talk to us about water resource management and the economic growth of Korea. Mr. Wu, please.
Well, for my time of 10 minutes, I'd like to briefly show you how water resources affected national economy in Korea and vice versa. So that is story based on Korea's past experiences. You see, I'd like to start from water and economics in general. Then I'd like to mention about history of Korea's water resource policies. And then I'd like to summarize what I'm saying. You see, everybody knows about green growth or green economy. And I'd like to emphasize again, water and green growth. In most developed countries, I think water has been indispensable for progressive development or national development and economic growth, and has been being recognized as a driving force for green economy and growth in the 21st century. But for the developing countries, better access to clean water, sanitation services, and water management creates tremendous opportunity for the poor people and is a progressive strategy for economic growth. And I'd like to export one speech from Mr. Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General. I omit the first two parts. Then too often in the world, where we need water, we find only guns. So that means a conflict of water internationally, nationally, and locally, ethnically. You see, this is the a plus between the municipal water withdrawal, municipal water use, and the GDP. And there is a clear linear relationship between the water withdrawal for municipal water use and the GDPs here. You see, Republic of Korea is here. There is a clear linear relationship, but at a certain point, we have a flat relation between these two factors. And as for industrial water use or withdrawal, the relation is scattered, but still there is a relation of increase of industrial water use with the GDP increase. And the Republic of Korea is here. And as for agricultural water use, the relation between these two factors is inverse. As the GDP increase, there is a very diverse scatters of points, but usually there is an inverse relationship because as GDP increase, the industrial structures changes from a primary structures to tertiary structures or secondary and tertiary structures. And this is the very simple relation between GDP per capita of Korea with respect to years. And in the 1960s, when Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world and absolutely recipient countries, then nowadays we have more than 20,000 capita, which means we are nowadays donoring countries. There is a certain decrease, these 2 points, which were caused by financial crisis. The first one is IMF crisis. Second one is Asian-oriented financial crisis in 2008 or 2007. 7. But in general, these two drops are obviously due to the changes in exchange rate, not the industry itself. The industry becomes gradually or sometimes rapidly increased. Okay. There are some more detailed social and economic indices of Korea. GDP per capita, you see from 1960s, 100 US dollars, nowadays 20 times. And populations, 200% increase. And industrial structure changes. In the 1960s, all three sectors were evenly distributed. Nowadays, tertiary structures, industrial composition dominates while the secondary follows, then primary is a small portion of the total industrial combinations. And water demand increased by 500% for the last 50 years. You see, this graph shows the increase in GDP and increase in national investment of social SOC budget. You see, for this SOC budget, about 10% compromise in water investment, water sectors. But during the 1970s, 80s, we had effective storage enough. Then, without any detailed calculation, we suppose these two enough effective storage made a big contribution to the increase in GDP and SOC investment. Let me, second part, briefly explain history of water resource policy in every 10 years, starting from 1960s. You see, in the early 1960s, the Korean government first made so-called National Economic Development Master Plan for 5 years. It lasted for 5 terms, that means 25 years. Then in the 1970s, they made so-called national land development. In this case, national land development means SOC development, social overhead capital, including water resource development. And during the 1970s, 1980s, they invested a lot of money for the good size water resource development. And then in the 1980s, we had a acceleration in economic growth. And in the 1990s, it was a very important period for the Korean water policy because during this period, we had experienced some water quality problems, social problems. Then the government established an environmental agency at that time, which became the Ministry of Environment nowadays. Very, very important and strong, government agencies. And especially in the 1990s, because at that time, the Liu announcement made in 1992, so we tried to consider environmental aspect when we dealt with water resource sectors. And then in the 2000s, we needed economic, social, and environmental balances. And then we tried to change so-called ESSD to green growth or green economy in these days. You see, let me briefly explain again the aspect of water resource policy in each period. 1960s, as I said, the first economic development master plan was established. And this is the initiation of rapid development in economic sectors of Korea. And in 1970s, so-called National Land Development, SOC Development Master Plan, started. And then 1980s, economic growth was accelerated. Then we first made a water resource development master plan for the 20 years. It revised, and it continued until nowadays. Then in the 1990s, there was a conflict between development and conservation of nature or conservation of environment. And we try to emphasize the importance of nature conservation or living environment conservation. So we made an environment agency, now became Minister of Environment. Then in 2000, you see, it is important for making balance between economics, social, and environmental aspects. So we say water, environment, climate change, nexus. Then in order to accomplish these missions, you see, this is the present status of a rate of population using improved drinking water sources. Also, this is the rate of population connected to public services. All are fulfilled in standard aspect. Then we need to consider this. Well, let me, okay, again, this. Yeah, we need to consider national water security to cope with climate change. Everybody says about climate change obviously occurring in this world. Then we may consider the lack of water or too excessive water. In order to that, our national water master plan is revised with considering these changes. Then also this new government emphasized so-called creative economy, in which there are two concepts. One is the new ideas makes new entrepreneurships, and convergence of IT technologies with existing technologies make new jobs and new industries. In accordance with this new government's concept, we are trying to consider convergence of water technologies and with ICT, such as smart water grid, smart river management, or hydrological monitoring technologies based on the ICT. Now I'd like to summarize what I'm saying very quickly. You see, it is obvious from the past experience that continuous investment of government budget into water infrastructures, a large-scale infrastructures, especially during the 1970s, 80s until 1990s, was a driving force for progressive social and economic developments of Korea. And then especially investments into water resources during the 1960s, 80s, again, were a cornerstone for achieving the present national economic growth. And we found a close relationship between economic growth and water management. And recent social issues, we see we must consider nature and environment. So we say coexistence of man and nature. And everybody says about sustainability since the 1992 and climate change since the 2000. So those are bottom lines of national water management policy. We are trying to disperse our water facilities. We are trying to more depending on the so-called low-impact development rather than the large-scale development. So Korean government has established newly a national water policy reflecting national water welfare and has been responding actively to and cooperate with the global issues such as climate change. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wu, for that very interesting expose and analysis of the social and economic development of your country, and also how this is reflected. Oh, thank you. Well, I guess you heard me anyway, and also how this is reflected in the environmental policies of your country, shifting over time. So thank you again. We will save the questions in order to save time. As I said, we're under quite some time constraints here. So we will save the questions. Please make a note and remember them to the session at the end where we will have questions and answers, etc. So save your questions, and we will move directly to the next speaker, who is Dr. Mohammed Aslam Chaudhary, who is the head of the newly established United Nations Office for Sustainable Development, which is part of the Division for Sustainable Development within the UN. So actually based here in Korea, but has a very long career within UN in New York, and very experienced in the international negotiations on all aspects of sustainable development. So please, Dr. Chaudhary, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to brief you with regard to what is happening with regard to SDGs and post-2015 development agenda. What are the processes going on and what we are expecting to get out of those processes. And these two processes, the SDG, it was basically mandated at Rio Plus 20 conference, and the process with regard to post-2015 development agenda was mandated by the General Assembly in 2010. The first question comes essentially that why an SDG on water? This is the kind of outline which I'm basically going to cover as much as I could in the 10 minutes allotted time. But the first issue is why SDGs on water. Well, we all know that there are abundant examples of the fact that water contributes a great deal in the socio-economic development of any country or any society. And I think the previous presentation in the very first slide, basically they have highlighted that role. And it makes those contributions through different sectors like energy, like food security, like agriculture, or like health services. The second important reason for having an SDG on water is that the demand for water is increasing for several reasons. And some of those reasons are basically the population growth is increasing. We are expected to have a population of about 8 billion in 2050. Together with that population, there would be increased demand for food, for energy, and for other water-related products and services. And then at the same time, in certain parts of the world, the economic growth is increasing in many emerging economies, which are also changing the patterns of consumption and production, and that's also placing a higher demand on the water side. And finally, there is going to be a study done by Chair's your group, Water 2030 group, has came up with the conclusion that by 2030, there would be a 40% gap between the supply and the demand. So that's going to be a huge gap, and so that's why we needed somehow to find a better ways to manage the water. The third point here is that a number of factors such as climate change, population dynamics, and power balances, they are really changing the economic and the political landscape of the world. And some of the countries, also the traditional model of donors and recipient is also changing. Some of the countries which were emerging countries, they were recipient at some point in time, but now they have become the donors. And finally, the point on this particular issue is that there is an unfinished agenda of the MDG, and let's try to look at it very briefly. In terms of the drinking water, we all know that this target has been met in 2010. Approximately 2 billion people got an access to the drinking water from improved water sources. But the unfinished part is that there are more than 780 million who still needs access to water. On the sanitation side, it's clear all the data and evidence shows that basically this target is totally off the track, and we will not be able to meet it by 2015. So this has to be carried over to the next phase of the post-2015 development agenda. And the next one is the hygiene, although it is not really part of the MDG framework, but in recent discussions, it's coming out very strongly because of its very strong connections with the health side. And so there was also no sort of monitoring, particularly because it was really not part of the MDG framework. But available information indicates that there are about 26% of the countries who have some kind of one way or the other target on the hygiene. And finally, on the water management side, there was no target or goal within the MDG framework, but we did have a goal in the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation of preparing the water management and efficiency plans by 2005. A recent study of UN Water, which they did for 133 countries, there are some interesting findings in that study. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but the important thing is that 65 of the surveyed countries indicated that they have been able to prepare the water management efficiency plans as was called for in the JPOI. And then 67% of the countries have reported that they have included in water in their national development plans and or in poverty reduction strategies. Now, the most important thing is really moving forward. Now, moving forward from the MDG to the SDG process, what are the issues which needs to be addressed and what are the things which we need to take care of? While on the one hand, if we see that MDGs really played a very, very important role in pushing forward the whole socioeconomic development agenda, but at the same time, it was not without the criticism. So the three main criticisms on the general MDGs were that basically MDGs failed to reach the poorest of the poor. Number two, that they did not promote integration of three pillars or three dimensions of sustainable development. And number three was that they did not recognize the need for an inclusive growth. And the result being that the development and environment was not brought together. So keeping that in mind, basically I have listed these 7 issues. There are many, but these 7 seems to be more important than the others, that as we move towards the SDG framework. One is the focus. Focus really, really should have to be on the poverty eradication. It has to be framed in a way that basically it could target elimination of poverty and also ensure that the 3 dimensions of the sustainable development are brought together. Universality, it has a different dimension. One dimension is that if you look the progress, if you look the picture from the global perspective to the national perspective, it's kind of strange that at the global level, for example, you have achieved the drinking water targets, but at the country level, there are, I think, about close to 30 countries which have not achieved that target. And in other words, what it means is if all the countries would have been able to achieve the target of having the population who do not have access to the water, probably we would have exceeded the MDG target. So that is something as we move forward, basically we need to take care of it. But at the same time, we know so far the discussions which have taken place at different forums, including the intergovernmental fora, that whatever the shape SDGs would take, they would be universal, they would be global, but at the same time, the countries would basically have their own strategies and own paths to achieve those goals with the principles of common but differentiated principality. Now, the positioning of the target, there was a big issue that it was really not a great idea to have the water target within the environmental sustainability goal. Probably it could have been better to have it in the health goal. And then half and half, when you say having this, that essentially means that people reach out to those first who are easy to reach. So in that sense, the inequalities becomes more worse. And then there are also definitional issues which probably you all are familiar with regard to whether it should be a safe drinking water or whether it should be a water through an improved water source. And then inequality in access means basically urban versus rural inequalities are very clear and monitoring has been very weak. So good monitoring is key to the good reporting and analysis as we move forward. And particularly, there was no effort of tracking MDG into the other goals. Now, I have just passed on one slide what processes are going on, just getting to the 3 narratives which are emerging from the discussion so far. A water agenda, which is really the extension and expansion of the existing agenda. Basically, it will have 3 streams, which is WASH, which is water resources management, and then which is wastewater protection and management. And then water within development agenda is a kind of an approach, which is a Nexus approach. It tries to connect you to the other economic sectors, and basically it's derived from the national development plans and the national development visions and the national poverty reduction strategies documents. So in other words, it becomes more people-centered, and the biggest advantage seems to be that it has a connectivity with regard to the national implementation processes and public expenditures and other governance mechanism. Then a development agenda is an even much more broader concept, where essentially what you try to see is that the issues such as governance and accountability, rule of law, and peace, basically they take the center stage in terms of eliminating the poverty, and then water essentially get embedded into somewhere in the process as well. So these are the three narratives, and I'm just going to show this slide, basically, that the report of the high-level panel is out, and essentially they have asked for 5 shifts, and this is the illustrative goals which they have proposed, and you could see the 6th goal on water and sanitation, and basically there is also a target which is given in goal 5, which is food security and good nutrition. And finally, I think the positioning of water in the development agenda, it will have a prominent position as we move forward, given all the reasoning for it, and the preparatory process for SDGs really much more energized as compared to the MDG process, because in their MDG there was no process. 2000, the Millennium Summit took place, and then we struggled for 4 years to figure out how really to translate those MDGs at the country level. And the final point is the convergence of SDGs and post-2015 development agenda. It is at this particular stage as we speak, is not clear that how they are going to converge, but I guess as the discussions move forward within the open working group and in the post-2015 development agenda team, probably they'll find the ways to connect to each other. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaudhary, for providing this excellent overview of where we are on the post-2015 development agenda, and also for the processes ahead of us. Indeed, we will have an interesting year and a half ahead of us, where there will be a lot of discussions in various fora. So thank you. The next speaker is Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, who is the CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, CEEW, an independent policy research institute in India, established with the aim of finding integrated approaches, integrated solutions on many of the issues that we are currently facing. So not only water, but a much broader agenda, but where water is indeed a cornerstone. So please, Dr. Ghosh.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the Global Green Growth Institute and the Government of Korea for inviting me, and thanks very much to Mr. Berntil for chairing this discussion. If you recall, what Mr. Berntil started his remarks by was about different perceptions of water risk that companies, countries, other stakeholders perceive. So the presentation I want to give you is, how do we reimagine water security? How do we think about it in the context of larger developmental as well as security dimensions, and thereby perhaps find new avenues through which different sets of stakeholders could come together to try and solve the problem. But let me start with a bunch of numbers just to kind of get you thinking about. Those are numbers related to energy consumption, per capita energy consumption, in 2 different metrics. And those are the countries. The top, that's China, India, Brazil, and the United States. And you can see the differentials. Those are numbers for the percentage of the population without access to improved water sources or to improved sanitation. Now, why do I bring up these figures, these per capita numbers, and why do I, more importantly, bring up pictures of children? It's because access to resources, whether it's water, whether it's energy, whether it's land, is of course necessary for growth, and that is what we are here for, but they are also primarily necessary for basic needs. And unless we are able to provide these resources for basic needs, the agenda for growth might get upstaged. And that's the context within which the policies for integrating water, energy, climate change, etc., would have to be thought about. And this matters even for the fastest growing economies in the world. I'm going to quickly talk about a few challenges that my own country faces with regard to water, but then I'm going to try and highlight a few ideas on how we can reimagine water security. In terms of the quantum of water, the estimates are that the total amount of water required will exceed the amount of water supplied in the next 2 decades. More importantly, and unlike Korea, for instance, Dr. Wu's presentation, you recall, in a country like India, all 3 sectors, agriculture, industry, services, households, all will be simultaneously growing. It's not a linear stage. Therefore, the water demand will not only rise across the economy, but across sectors as well. In India, very little potential for additional irrigation remains, which means that what has happened is a lot more emphasis has gone onto groundwater exploitation. And many of the larger states, which are agricultural powerhouses, Punjab, Rajasthan, Haryana, etc., the groundwater extraction is already exceeding the groundwater recharge. That you have to situate in the larger context of what's happening with resource markets around the world. Those are numbers from across the globe in terms of food prices and crude oil prices, etc. A lot of it linked to the water economy. And you will see across over the last 4 decades, we are back to the indexed prices for resources are back to what they were about 4 decades ago. So we are entering a stage of high prices for commodities as well as more volatile prices for commodities. Let me skip through some of the challenges on the urban water side. Also recognize that in terms of climate change, we have now a large part of the globe, about 10% of the globe, faced with extreme weather events and extremes of temperature. And then within industry, a huge amount of water goes towards the power sector. In fact, in India, about 98% of additional withdrawals will come from the power sector in the overall industrial space. So what that means is that we are actually faced with a resource nexus, not just a water challenge, where water and energy and food and climate are factors that also have impacts on each other. And I can talk about this in a little more detail, but I want to start talking about the solutions. So how do we reimagine water security? If we talk about irrigation, a lot of the historical emphasis has been on the supply side. So if we want to introduce demand-side efficiency, we've got to try and start integrating and using different stakeholders for that purpose. My organization, in fact, with the support of the Water Resources Group, the Council on Energy, Environment and Water prepared India's National Water Resources Framework for the 12th five-year plan. It's a massive document, but I have illustrated summaries of it if some of you are interested, which covered all of these different aspects of irrigation, groundwater, legal, regulatory changes, etc. But particularly on irrigation, there are examples already across the world, whether it's in India, more than 50,000 water user associations. In China, using contractors to improve water use efficiency. In Mexico, developing the capacity of water user associations, and so forth. There are ways in which you can engage with farmers, with local communities, to integrate groundwater management, energy strategies, and agricultural strategies. How do we reimagine water security when it comes to industrial water use? One of the main areas is, of course, where the business opportunity lies. Those numbers suggest that there are potential for using different types of technology and increasing water savings all the way up to 90%. And we can target industrial clusters as zones of sustainability, where you think about sustainability in terms of water, sanitation, land management, and so forth. On power plants, we looked at solar power, which is supposed to be clean power, but we mapped it onto the state of Rajasthan, the desert state of Rajasthan. And we said if these solar power plants are going to come up, and thermal power is going to come up, and a Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor is going to come up, how are you going to deal with these red districts are water stressed, where groundwater is overexploited? How do we deal with that? So we've got to encourage innovation in water-saving technologies in the power sector itself. How do we reimagine water security in urban water services, in municipal water? And of course, we hear a lot about public-private partnerships. Actually, even where formal PPP contracts don't exist, a lot of particular activities in urban water sector are already performed by the private sector. But what happens is, and as the plenary session before our session was mentioning, that there are perceptions of risk that increase. As you extend the number of years for which you want the private sector to be involved, there's a lot of pressure on risks. So there are ways in which you can weave in, again, communities, private sector, and the government to extend the PPPs across a long period of time. Very quickly, I have about 1 minute and 50 seconds. Very quickly, let's talk about water in terms of better data. Across India, for instance, we collect water from the data from the field and bring it up across state data processing centers, regional processing centers, and so forth. But what we don't think about enough is how communities can be involved to become the source of better water data, more usable water data. And finally, all of this has to be integrated at a governance level. So we designed a plan whereby you'd have state governments, you would have basin water councils, but you would integrate it with a range of other departments that would be interested and have a stake in how water is managed. What this graphic shows you very simply is that when you start integrating the energy sector with the water sector, with environmental challenges, you often end up with negative relationships. You often end up with trade-offs. And it's important to start recognizing and admitting and acknowledging those trade-offs so that we can start finding how we can develop co-benefits. How can we reduce water usage in the energy sector so it provides water for agriculture? How do we increase water use efficiency in agriculture so it provides water for industrial use? We've got to first recognize the trade-offs and then integrate to find the solutions. I want to leave you with a couple of slides. This picture is from a forest in southern India where I was investigating different business models for social enterprise. This is a house belonging to a farm laborer. But if you notice in this one picture, energy, there's a solar panel on that thatched roof. It's environmentally friendly because they don't chop down the trees. It's within the ecosystem. And you can't see the water droplet, but they're harvesting rainwater in that little pot. But even at the bottom of the pyramid, if people can integrate energy, environment, and water, surely we can do a better job of it. So to conclude, to reimagine water security and water governance, we've got to think of participation in the irrigation space. We've got to think about innovation in industrial water savings. We've got to think about education and extensions of partnerships in municipal water, and we have to think about integration of institutions across levels of governance. Only then can we bring together a range of stakeholders to start solving problems that are germane to our development and growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ghosh, for both outlining the challenges in India as a result of economic growth and climate change, but also on pointing towards the need for an integrated approach, since the challenges are also very cross-sectoral. We need to adopt a Nexus approach, and also for pointing out towards how that approach can be institutionalized when it comes to the governance structure, etc. So. Very good. Thank you so much. Our next speaker will take us to the discussion about disaster risk reduction for global sustainability. Dr. Kuniyoshi Takushi from the International Center for Water Hazard and Risk Management, the founding director of this center, ICHARM, under the auspices of UNESCO. He has been a professor in environmental engineering for many years and has a very distinguished career as a researcher. Dr. Takeyoshi, please.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Is it okay? Well, I also like to thank you very much, the organizer, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. Well, I like to talk about the disaster risk management. Water has lots of disasters. And this is for global sustainability because I think the green growth is one kind of approach to global sustainability. So in order to get green growth, we finally have to come into the global sustainability. Well, I think this one. Yeah, first I'd like to share with you some of the reality happening. That we have many disasters occurring, and all are the increasing number of the disaster events are increasing, and especially this is a hydromet hazard, which is water hazard, increasing very much. And if we think about the affected people basis, 95% are water related, including tsunami, of course, and also the many parts are Asian. 90% is actually 85% is Asian, the disasters. Well, so we know many disasters are happening, and you can see here the quite many the Indian Ocean tsunami, or Katrina, or Sidr, Nargis, or the Ketsana, Pakistan floods, the Japan, the Great East earthquake and the tsunami, and also Thailand, the Chaudhary floods and Sandy, you know, many of them. And I'd like to say, not only just the number of disasters are increasing and the affected people are increasing, but the type of disaster is changing from one localized disaster to globalized disaster. This is because of the independency of the society and the concatenations of the impacts happens because of this independency. So we have, for instance, the hazard concatenations, the kind of cascading effects. Then we have the impact also from the human the casualties, and then the properties and the infrastructure, utility, and then livelihood. And this livelihood impact goes into not only the local area, but the nations and regions and the globe. And this happened not only in Japan, but also in many other countries, like Thailand. We had the Chaudhary floods and affected many the large industrial parks. And this impact they spread into the region and also to the globe. So the hazard impact is really much. So the kind of the disaster itself is evolving to the new phase. And because of this, the disaster triggered by natural hazards are increasing intensifying, evolving, and the worst case scenario is happening because the vulnerability is now beyond expectation, and also the never experienced magnitude of hazards are coming because of climate change and the geophysical, the periodicity of seismic the phenomena. Therefore, just last month, the Ban Ki-moon they introduced the UN ISDR GAR report, and he said economic losses from disasters are out of control. This is the statement of the UN Secretary General. Economic losses from disasters are out of control. And he says our startling finding is the direct losses from floods, earthquakes, and drought have been underestimated by at least 50%. Why 50% underestimated? Because actually not the kind of disaster I mentioned, the big one, but there are many, many small floods or the water-related disasters, landslides or debris flows are happening all over the world. And those small the disasters are making the society totally different and totally affected their livelihood. And so far this century, direct losses from disasters are in the range of $2.5 trillion. This is unacceptable. When we have the knowledge to reduce the losses, we can reduce losses, and we can improve the benefit from water and and other natural resources. But we are suffering from 2.5 trillion only from 2000 to 2013. Okay, what we should do? That is what I like to say. You know, this is 2013. 2015 is very important. Already the Dr. Chaudhary and others mentioned. 2015, we have the MDG, or the Sustainable Development Goals, are coming out, post-MDG and the Sustainable Development Goals. And also, post-Hyogo Framework for Action is also in 2015. And by 2015, it is considered the Kyoto Protocol should be really including all countries, which means the United States even, they have some binding, the agreement should be made by 2015. So 2015 is a key year for, so this is very important. Post-Millennium Development Goals and the sustainable targets. For instance, the disaster people are thinking in this way. By 2030, half the population exposed to high disaster risk of natural hazard. Half the population exposed to high disaster risk. But now, addressing to developing countries, we consider half the population without protection against natural hazard below 10-year return period. Because if the return period, people are suffering in some society less than 10-year return period, how can they build their country? Economic development is possible. Well, I have to go further. And post-Hyogo Framework for Action, we have to monitor the development and vulnerability. You know, we have very nice Hyogo Framework for Action. Post-Hyogo Framework Action shouldn't exclude them. We have to monitor. You know, after the disaster happened, lots of countries come and support, but not before that. We have to monitor vulnerability increase and change of risk And then I like to skip, and this is the paradigm shift. You know, we used to have mass exposure of vulnerability and mass piecemeal works against disasters. And catastrophic disaster occurred. But now we should monitor risk before disaster happen and reduce exposure of vulnerability, and we should have the integrated disaster risk reduction. We like to have work together with water people and the economic people. We do like to have disaster risk reduction target in SDG, in water target, and also in eradication of poverty target. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Takushi, for this excellent presentation and also pointing towards how the local disasters develop and do have really global consequences, in particular when it comes to the effects on the economy. And also pointing towards the need for integration of these kind of aspects also in the SDG post-2015 development agenda. Thank you very much. So, last but not least is Dr. Torkild Jørn-Clausen from the Danish DHI group, where he is a water policy advisor, but he has many hats. I know several of them in different international arenas, the World Water Council, the Global Water Partnership, Stockholm International Water Institute, amongst others. And he will talk to us about the transboundary governance dimension of water and green growth. So, Dr. Clausen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and like everybody else, thank you so much for inviting me here. This is what I was asked to talk about, so that's what I'm doing. That may not be the most interesting issue in Korea, but for 40% of the world population live in transboundary basin. Therefore, this issue in the rest of the world is really very important. And let me say that when we talk about water and green growth, in my mind, we immediately talk about the water, energy, and food security nexus, as you've also heard from other speakers. And this really is about thinking how we link in the management, in the analysis, in the planning and implementation of everything we do, the water, energy, and food agenda. And how we address the trade-offs, as some of you also already mentioned, the impacts on the environment, for the climate, for people's livelihoods of this nexus. But this nexus, for the 40% of the population that live in transboundary basins, have serious transboundary implications. And let me just walk you through some of them. Now, it is very clear, for example, that if you look at energy, transboundary basins in Africa like Congo, the Nile, Orange in Southern Africa, LC Basin, Mekong, others, all of them have a big discussion about generating power upstream in the basin and sharing that with the needs downstream in the basin. So it's a big issue. Another big issue is food, of course, with the major water user. In several transboundary basins of the world, like in Indus, Zambezi, Niger, others, we are looking at a 2- to 6-fold increase in irrigation is being planned. Where will all that water come from? And when we look at fisheries, in the north, like in the Columbia and Danube, fisheries is looked at as sort of biodiversity issue. But in the Mekong, it's the main protein and food source for a lot of poor people. If we look at the ecosystem perspective of all of that, many transboundary basins have experienced that natural floods disappeared, ecosystems suffered, and many of these basins are now asking, why didn't we address that from the beginning, rather than coming back later at a lot higher cost to address the damages we did to our ecosystems. Poverty is a transboundary issue. 70% of the population in the transboundary basins in the south are below the poverty line. In the Mekong, for example, it's 30% of the people who live 15 kilometers from the river depend on that river for their income. These are all poor people who depend on that. And then, of course, it's clear that when we talk transboundary, it's a lot of information which is often difficult to get and very sensitive, but we can't deal with it unless we share it across boundaries and across sectors, which is, again, is a major issue. There are lots of issues. So how do we deal with it? Now, in the water community, we often talk about integrated water resources management. I think also you, Chaudhary, mentioned that. And we see it very much at the heart of the Nexus. It's not any contradiction to it. It's in the heart of the Nexus that we manage water in an integrated way. Now, RWM, as we call it, is not rocket science. It's very simple. It's a question of getting the right enabling environment of policies and legislation, the right institutional framework at central, local level, and the right management instrument to balance water for livelihood with water as a resource. It's very simple. The integration in RWM, or you can say, when you break it down, of course, it becomes less simple. If you practice RWM, you talk about allocation between users, pollution control, management of floods of droughts, doing that with the stakeholders. But there's a framework around that, which is important. And the important integration part of that is the horizontal integration between the sectors, managing water across domestic use, water for food, water for energy, water for nature, and also the vertical integration. Because, like you take Mekong Basin, any basin, 1,000 small watersheds form hundreds of small sub-basins, form basins, form large transboundary basins. So you have to integrate top-down and bottom-up all these levels. And that's a big challenge. It's very easy to say, it's very hard to do. So let me just take you, and this is what Dr. Hong asked me to do, so I'm doing what I'm told. I'm going to tell you about the Mekong as an example of that. Now, the Mekong is one of the world's largest river transboundary basins, 60 million people. Starts up in the Himalayas of China, goes through China, Myanmar a little bit, Laos, Cambodia, we heard Cambodia today, and ends up in Thailand, and ends up in the delta of Vietnam, where you have about 20 million poor people living in the delta. It's a mighty river. This is what it looks like at the upstream, and the waterfall is where the river crosses between Laos and Cambodia, the Kone Falls. Very impressive river. And it is, like so many rivers in the south, seasonal. I mean, we are getting all the water in a few months, and the rest of the time there's no water. You can wade across it almost. And then you can drown in the other part of the year. I mean, this is typical of many monsoon climate transboundary rivers. I mean, it doesn't make life easier. But on the average, there's still water in the Mekong. There's also a structure on the Mekong. In 1995, the 4 countries of the lower concluded an agreement of cooperation for sustainable development. The 2 upper countries are really not part of it, but are so-called dialogue partners. But there is a Mekong River Commission. There's a council of ministers that meet every year, a joint committee, a national Mekong committee. There's a whole structure around this for the countries to collaborate. And at the moment, that river, as I said, is critically important for the 60 million in the basin, for their livelihoods and their food security. So far, it's really largely undeveloped, and the state of the basin is still relatively good. But, there's a but. With this nexus, with all these drivers, there's heavy pressure. 12 mainstream dams across the main river are being planned in the Mekong. 4 dams are already built in China and more to come. And hundreds of dams, hundreds, are planned in the tributaries of the Mekong. That is going to make a major difference into that river. One of them that you may have read about, which has been discussed very much both locally, regionally, and internationally, is the Xayaburi Dam. The Xayaburi Dam will be the first dam across the main Mekong River downstream of China. And it's being discussed a lot from the perspective, the Xayaburi Dam will be built to produce energy. That's the purpose of it. But can we do that and then still preserve the freshwater fishery in the lower basin? It's the largest freshwater fishery in the world. They produce more fish in the Mekong than all of Australia produces. Plus the agriculture in the delta? Can all that food production survive that hydropower investments? And the other big fear is, of course, if you build one dam, will you open the sluices for building a lot of dams on the lower? So this Sayaburi Dam is obviously raising a lot of discussion. And while people are discussing, Lao government is building it. This is a picture from this year. So it's happening while we're discussing it. So the pressure here in the Mekong is clearly how do you balance the threats and the opportunity of energy production and food security. And as has been raised, these dams will be built, most of them, by private investors. And how do we develop these new public-private partnerships to deal with this? And then probably we'll have to, at a certain stage, look at the framework, because the framework does not consider all the development in the tributaries. So my conclusion from this is simply that if you're in a transboundary contract, the water, food, and energy security Nexus has really been a wake-up call to the water community, telling us that we need to address water in that broader societal context with the food and energy sectors. It also tells us that RWM is still the paradigm. It's still as valid as ever, because we need to manage water in dialogue with all the stakeholders at all the levels. Nothing has changed in that. And the Mekong illustrates that. The Mekong is a good illustration of the challenge in facing transboundary basins in the world. There's only one way forward, and that is that the countries and the stakeholders in these basins build mutual trust and work together. So I got the 2-minute sign, but I didn't get the red card, so I finish here. Right?
Good.
Did I?
Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Clausen, for presenting to us so clearly both the practical and political challenges of transboundary water management as such, and indeed many, as you pointed out very clearly, many depends on these waters for their livelihood opportunities. The Nexus approach that you pointed to is a common theme that I think we all agree on that needs to be adopted when we look at water in an integrated approach. So with this, we almost have 25 minutes left for discussion. I hope you have made notes of all the comments and questions that you might have now as a result of this. So with this, I do actually leave the floor open to any questions, comments, remarks that we might have from the audience. And I think we will gather a few questions, maybe 3 or so, and then ask the panel to respond to those. I'm not sure about how it works with microphones. I see some microphones standing down there, but there are also people with portable microphones here. So please, any questions from anyone? Starting with, yes, please. Microphone.
It's a great honor to question about something about water. I am researching environmental issue, especially in the relation with religious belief at Yonsei University, Seoul, Korea. I think water as resource has the sensitive issues between development and conservation. In the situation of some struggle or tension between two issues, what do you think about proper solutions in the perspective of sustainable development? Thank you.
Thank you, indeed. Yeah, that's one of the challenges that we are facing, indeed. More questions, please.
Hello. Hi, my name is Jesper, and I'm doing internship here for United Nations in Incheon. I have a question regarding the water energy nexus, and what role do you think virtual water could play to address the water energy food nexus here in the world, and in particular in Asia, because many of the food food exporting countries in the world face enormous water stress, particularly China, India, and also the United States. So what role do you think virtual water could play to address this? Thanks.
Thank you. Also a very good question to our panel, who I think are very well suited to address that. So, one more question, please. If not, so while you think of more questions to come up with, we will ask the panel to reflect upon those two questions. One about this balance between water for development or water for conservation on the one hand, and also what role water would play in particular in the energy production, and to what extent that is the solution, and whether that will also have effects on other uses of water, in particular for food security, etc. So, who in the panel would like to start? Mr. Ghosh.
Both questions are very pertinent for emerging economies. So I'm going to try and integrate my answer to both. We did not talk about ecological flows, but that's essentially what your question is about. You know, how much water do you need for conservation and renewal and rejuvenation of the hydrological system per se. And there's across the world, we've looked into this a little bit. You know, is there a ballpark? Is there a benchmark that we could use? For instance, the Australian law has now suggested that it should go up to about 35 to 40% over the next decade and a half for the Murray-Darling Basin for just ecological flows. Now, for emerging economies, that's not going to happen overnight. You're not going to go from barely any allocation for ecological flows to a huge allocation. So that's where this approach to the water energy nexus, and along with that the food nexus, becomes a crucial one. How can you incrementally start wedging in the sustainability dimension? So a couple of things. One is, and I mentioned this when I talk about participation of farming communities, the challenge is the farmers have a sort of a contractual relationship with the water providers, the irrigation departments. They've not been given any incentive for water conservation per se. So that means what kind of crop water budgeting can you do using data that farmers have themselves collected? Number two is, what is the quality of the electricity or the energy you're providing for your water usage? If the electricity or the energy is intermittent, the usage of water will be intermittent and less efficient. So that's the other angle where you have to start working on. And number three, ultimately, you have to price. Pricing does not mean that the poorest of the poor have to necessarily pay. You can formulate ways in which you create the safety nets for the poor, for poorer farmers vis-a-vis larger farmers. But if you're not pricing, if you're not attaching a value to what it is that you're using, you're never going to create the incentives for conservation. Let me stop there.
Thank you. Excellent. Dr. Takushi wanted to comment on this also.
Yeah, well, I like to point out, within the concept of green growth, the environmental protection or environmental concern is not a constraint, or not a kind of holding back the effect. But the environmental concern or environmental paying attention is a driver for development. How can it be possible? That is a real question. Within the green growth concept, the environmental flow or environmental the care should be the player or the driver of development. And I like to say your Mekong case. Now the Saiyan and the 12 other the mainstream the dams is proposed and already started. This is a nexus the question too. Well, I don't have answer. But we have to go together and find out, not stop this the kind of green, or I mean the clean energy or the hydro energy. But why don't us to come up with the best solution using this hydroecology or the eco-hydrology as a tool for integrated water resources management? Because the integrated water resources management, eco-hydrology is one of the tools to make the green growth as a green, keeping green not as a kind of holding back, but it is a pusher. And the science and technology has to find the way to make a compromise. This is maybe not just a compromise, but it is a pusher. It is a driver of development. And if we don't find that sort of solution, then green growth will never go. This is just a dream. But we have to do our best using all the science and technology and to find how this the greenization can be a driver for development.
Indeed, if I just may add to that myself, I come from Sweden. We're part of the European Union, and I can say that in the European Union, at least, the experience is that the ever increasing standards for environmental protection has really been a driver for development of new technologies, new approaches to environmental protection, which has also helped actually the industry to develop and become more resource efficient, which eventually also has helped them also economically for their operation. So I think actually the industry to a large extent has gained from the increasing pressure on them that has been put by politicians. But Dr. Clausen.
Yeah, let me comment on both of them. To you who are studying this question of development and conservation, conservation, I think, yeah, sometimes conservation may be the issue, but I think the real issue is ecosystem and ecosystem services, the broader one. Conservation is a subset of that. If you look at the Mekong again, these ecosystems, if you build one dam, the Tonle Sap Lake, the natural flooding, all of that could be jeopardized. But that would hurt a lot of poor people's livelihoods. The giant catfish, other species would disappear. It would hurt both biodiversity and people. And as you say, Dr. Ghosh, I mean, my first note was also environmental flows. There are mechanisms to how to value this and how to value these services and how to take payment for them. So we should look at it in a more progressive way than just conservation, I think. And I suggest you try to do that. Now, when it comes to your question on the Nexus, I think it's a tricky question because it's a tricky issue. I mean, in the transboundary basin, for example, that I'm talking about, I think what we have to talk about is we do not share water, but we share the benefits to water. So if you create benefits one place, for example, by generating power upstream, you share it with downstream. And it is that sharing of benefits that is the key. And it's not only physically within transboundary basin. And in fact, I think 5% of all agricultural production or something like that is shipped between countries as what is called virtual water in products. So that you grow the food where you have the land and the water and send the food to where they don't, rather than wasting a lot of water for growing food where you have water shortages. So, and that then calls on collaboration. And that is where water becomes very political. I mean, in some of these basins, it's not just a question of having good people who can value the services and we can lay out all the solutions, but what does that help if at the political level it's not bought into? And in most of these issues end up in political struggles, and some of these struggles are simply impossible to deal with from a technical point of view, because it defeats technical rationale sometimes. So I think that's why I put it on my slide. I think one of the key issues here is trust. Building trust so that these political issues can be dealt with. And in many basins of the world, that trust is not there. In other basins, it's coming. In some basins, it was there and it's now disappearing. It's going up and down like politics. But we have to recognize that the politics of water is an important issue in all of that. And that is where I think the Nexus thinking is helping us putting that spotlight on that issue. Yeah.
Dr. Chaudhary.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Just a minor comments. I totally agree with what the other panelists have said. But I have a general problem with this terminology of conservation versus development. I mean, they don't go hand in hand. So actually the formulation is really not really, we don't have to talk about conservation, but we need to talk about it, how to use water more efficiently so that it could support the development process. And in order to use water more efficiently, basically you have to have a right kind of governance system in place, the right kind of institutions and policies that could support the judicial use of water. But if you are just doing conservation, okay, you conserve it, then you don't move. So I think that was the kind of framing, I would say that, how to use water more efficiently to promote development. Thank you.
I think that is why the international discourse has moved towards green growth, green economy as such, to try to resolve that issue. Dr. Wu.
Yes, I'd like to explain the seeming conflict between conservation and development in the concept of green growth. You see, let me speak about green growth, the concept of green growth in my perspective, if I am right. You see, green growth means economic and social growth or development with less depending on fossil fuel or non-renewable natural resources, and thus guaranteeing the environmental sustainability. You see, before the IWRM is very popular, becomes popular, we used so-called multi-purpose water resource development. In the United States in 1930s, TBA, and in Korea in 1960s, 70s. At that time, everybody said it was the best idea. But that idea was based on the so-called engineering function of water, such as maximizing water use, maximizing water control, and maximizing fishery. But you see, as you said, we have another important function from water, of water, so-called ecosystem, ecological service. We call it an environmental function or natural function, in which we must consider so-called ecological habitat, self-purification of water, and asset value of water. So with the concept of multipurpose water resource development, we do not cover the ecological function of water. So integrated water resource management or integrated water resources development has a very useful function, useful concept to cover the environmental function as well as the engineering function. But what I'm saying is, the tool, any tools for implementing IWRM should be different on locally or on nationally or continent, on different climate zones. It should be based on the adaptive skills or management tools for implementing the IWRM. That might be my answers.
Thank you. Excellent. We started 3:20, and we were promised to have 1.5 hours, so we will close in 5, which leaves us with sort of 6 minutes. So we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, but then the panel will have to sort of restrict their responses also. So, please. Yeah.
This is Chaudhary working for GGGS. My question is going to Mr. Chaudhary about the Sustainable Development Goals indicators. If I recall, the specific indicators related to water in the MDGs framework, we just have the drinking water access and access to proper sanitation. That's 2, right? And goal number 7. And there was a concern that those 2 indicators are not enough to reflect the other aspects of water dimension, including disaster dimension, blah, 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 blah. And the other aspect is those two indicators are not covering the quality dimension of water, drinking water, per se. So, given the fact that the coming SDGs is more broad concept than MDGs, more universal concept, so why should the indicators to be implemented, to be invented related to water sector for covering developed and developing countries? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Since that was specifically to Dr. Chaudhary, maybe there might be another question. Yes, please, here's one for the other in the panel as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Salvador Lopez. I'm also with GGGS in Latin America. And one of the questions I have is I'd like to hear your ideas about how to free up funding for the implementation of some of these initiatives that we've been discussing. And given the fact that, at least where I'm from, water is owned by the state, a lot of the utilities are publicly owned, the ability to generate enough revenue, one, to meet minimum requirements of supply and sanitation. But in countries like, say, Mexico, that make progress in meeting those basic needs, but need to move beyond to use new paradigms of evolving the flows of funding sources and so forth. What are some of these, the ideas, the possibilities, the potential role of the private sectors to generate the real money and to mainstream and to perhaps scale for
Thank you very much. If you hadn't asked that question, I had intended to pick that up myself. How can we get the involvement of the private sector, in particular in the area of water resource management, where they by and large have been absent so far, and how can that potentially contribute to investments in infrastructure, for example? So we have one particular question for Dr. Chaudhary, and maybe the other ones would like to pick up. We have to be very brief, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I think you are spot on right that our targets during the MDGs were sort of not very well expanded because there were a number of other issues like the hygiene. We talked about water resources management. We talked about wastewater protection and management. Those were not included. So I think one of the important things which is going to happen as we move from MDGs to the SDGs process, and it's quite clear from the discussions which are going on under the open working group that these are the kind of dimensions which will be included there. So there is a WASH, there is a water resources management, and a wastewater. And an indication, you could see the report of the high-level panel. And if you look at that goal there, you also see these streams essentially being reflected as targets of the unified water goal. Now, your question with regard to indicators is, I think the discussions have really not reached to a point yet where they could start talking about the indicators. First, really, there has to be some kind of agreement on the targets, then they need to move work on indicators. But I understand that there are different parts of the system in the UN who have already initiated work on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Chaudhary. So anyone else who would like to comment on the private sector and financing part. Torkil?
Yeah, briefly, for example, again, the hundreds of dams I mentioned in the Mekong, the dams that are built in Africa, the private sector is engaging big time now in hydraulic infrastructure. These dams are built by private developers. And the big challenge for some of the developing countries with weak governance systems is to get proper deals, because these concession agreements that could, if they are properly managed, also get these private investors into a partnership with the government, that it's in their interest to build these facilities, to protect the downstream, to protect the catchment, all that. So I think the world is changing very rapidly now with private sector in water resources management and hydraulic infrastructure. But I think there's still a long ways to go, because not all of the private investors are, well, subscribe to principles of sustainability. So that is, of course, a big challenge for governments.
Thank you, Torkil. Dr. Ghosh.
Very quickly, some ideas about how to stimulate private sector investment. On the irrigation side, and I briefly mentioned it, if we can use private contractors who essentially have to buy bulk water from the state and then have to sell it to water user associations, but the contract is structured in a way that the price of that bulk water reduces if the contractor is then able to demonstrate water use efficiency at the end user side. So it creates it's a dual incentive on both ends. On the drinking water side, there are, at least in my country, there are a huge number of social enterprises that have entered to try and invest and achieve a triple bottom line on water, health, and as well as economic sustainability. But what they need, and it's a question I raised in the plenary, is the working capital to keep going and increase the scale of operations. And very quickly on the industrial water use, one is there's no escaping better regulation, because without regulation, you're not going to be able to incentivize the conservation. But another emerging trend is a large number of private players who are generating water data, whether it's meteorological data or ground level data. That data has value, and companies want that data to assess their risks of operations. Once you pay for the data and you see that you are faced with a risk to your industrial strategy, you automatically begin to create the conditions and the incentives for conservation and actual water use.
Excellent. So several opportunities there. Is there anyone else in the panel that wants to respond, or very briefly? Yes?
Well, I like to point out these indicators and measurement of the vulnerability or the water security. This is a major issue in many the scientific areas, and also in this disaster area, we have a very big movement of collecting data and establishing the indicators. Because if we establish SDG or MDG, we have to monitor, follow up what the progress is. Then what kind of the indicator we should follow or monitor? This is the real question. And in disaster area, we have a kind of big monitoring the scheme we are establishing, and I think in many areas the same thing is happening. Once we have a target, then we have to monitor the progress. Then in order to monitor, we need indicator and the data. So this is coming up.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Wu, did you want to?
Just in a brief comment, you see, everyone knows that the importance of data collection and data analysis. In doing so, we need cutting-edge technologies, or so-called convergence technologies, mixed with such as information and communication technologies. So technology development might be given a very important, pivotal role in a very efficient system of data collection and analysis. That's my few comments.
Thank you so much. Well, we started this session with sort of outlining many of the huge challenges, and they are indeed real, and they will become worse, but I think we ended on a very positive note, clearly showing that there are indeed potential for resolving many of the challenges that we are facing, and in particular if we use the potential synergies that we do have within the water, food, energy, climate change nexus and use all the opportunities, both when it comes to new and emerging technologies, involvement of the private sector, and with new and innovative solutions when it comes to governance structure. So thank you to the panelists. I thank you very much to all of you who have challenged us with your very good questions. I think we're all worth a big round of applause. Thank you.